you introduce yourself?
Well, most people these days call me Papa because they're teenagers who are my grandchildren. But I would introduce myself as a lifelong activist who keeps trying to retire, and they just keep pulling me back in because things that happen in America continue to outrage me, and I can't just sit back and do nothing. I grew up in Georgia in the 1950s. That was the height of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was sort of the nickname of American apartheid. Apartheid is a system of government where you divide people along racial lines and have absolute citizenship and absolute rights for one group and dehumanization of the other group. And there's signs everywhere that say, blacks, dogs, and Chinese not allowed. A real sign, that's a real sign that we used to see on stores and things when I was growing up. Jim Crow also had a very lot of specific rules. Okay, for instance, when I was 4.5, maybe 5, my great uncle had to take me and all my cousins who were boys out into the city and show us you can't go in that door, you can't go in this door. And if we could barely read and write, but we had to learn the letter C and the letter W because one was colored and one was white. And the way he explained it to us when we were like, you know, kindergarten or first grade age was that if you walk through that door, you may never see your mama again. That's all we knew at that age. We didn't know why that was. That was just all we knew because it was important to learn that because it was true. Okay, the first time I decided that Jim Crow was wrong and I wanted to do something about it, really upset my parents, but it was an incident where we were going to the farmer's market. And we didn't know we were poor or impoverished, but we were, okay. And we would go to the farmer's market in Atlanta, which is where I grew up, which is a huge space, about 7 or 8 city blocks. And they had row after row after row of stalls where farmers came and sold their vegetables and stuff. And at the end of each row, there was a bathroom for women and a bathroom for men. But they all said white men only, white women only, okay? And then way on the far side, there was one colored bathroom. And I was about 8 or 9, and my little brother, who's the youngest, okay, he was about 3.5, and he said, "Mom, I got a TT." So my mother told my father, "Jimmy, take him to the colored bathroom, and Timothy will take Jimmy out, and he'll go." And we got out of the car and walked up to the bathroom, and my father had taken us to the wrong bathroom. It was the white only bathroom, okay? And this is a 3-year-old who sees the urinal, sees the toilets right through the door, okay? And wondered why I stopped. And I tried to explain to him why we can't go in there. And this is out of the mouth of a babe. He said, "But it's right there. But the bathroom is right there." And I said, "No, we can't go in there. We can't go in there." And he started screaming. And you don't scream or draw attention to yourself in Jim Crow because white people would pay attention to you. And staying alive means white people should not notice you. And if they do notice you, you don't look them in the eye. You let them walk down the sidewalk. You get off the sidewalk. These are all the rules of Jim Crow. So I was scared that these white people were going to start paying attention to us. So I just pulled little Jimmy back, and he began to wet his pants and stuff like that. And he's still like that. He's kind of prissy even today in his 60s. But he was very embarrassed to be wet and just cried and cried and cried all the way home. And I hadn't taken the time to explain to him what colored and white meant, okay? And my mother did when we got back in the car. And this is out of the mouth of a 3.5-year-old. He said, "I don't want to be colored no more. I don't want to be colored no more. I don't like being colored. I don't want to be colored no more." Okay? For years, those words of a 3.5-year-old just stuck with me. Okay? When I was in demonstrations with John Lewis, when I was in the Black Panther Party, when I was, asking Dr. King if I could wash his car, just try to be around him, okay? Um, that's what stuck with me. The reason I was doing this is because that little voice was always in the back of my head. I don't want to be colored no more, okay? And what I had to learn about the C and the W, and if you do the wrong thing, you never see your mama again, okay? And this is what a lot of people in the civil rights movement would tell you the same thing. And this, the first person that ever told me this was John Lewis, actually. He was telling me 3 other people, okay? He was only about 22 or something like that, and I was, you know, that's an old head for a guy in the movement, being 22 years old. And I was in my teens, my mid-teens, and he was saying that we want to be the last generation to ever have to be taught that shit. Excuse my French, but that's what he said. That's an excellent question. Uh, Mainly black college students. And this particular thing is mainly older black students who are like freshmen in college, senior in high school, and they read about Jim Crow and segregation and that kind of thing, and they find out that in a lot of towns, because the black people weren't allowed in white country clubs, in some places they started their own country club. Or in some towns they had streets where all the businesses were black. Because once segregation was over and we had integration, there was no need for that because we were allowed in the same movie theaters and the same thing as white people. So those businesses either got absorbed by white businesses or there was no need for them to exist. A younger person looking back on that today looks at it as saying, well, what the civil rights movement did was destroy black businesses because we had all these businesses that black people used to have and now they don't have them. What's wrong about that is that in big places like Atlanta or Birmingham or New Orleans or even famously Tulsa, Oklahoma, okay, yeah, you had a large enough black middle class that they might have had a movie theater or a few restaurants, okay? But in most black towns and in most cities in the South, black people had nothing, okay? So that's a misreading of history because it's myth that the civil rights movement destroyed black businesses. No, that's not what happened. What happened was the civil rights movement opened up opportunities. You know what the word ideology is? You ever heard that word? It's like a thought discipline, a school of thought. You have a certain number of things that you think are important that matter to you, okay? And you adhere, okay, to the belief that this is worth my time, that's worth my time, that's worth my time. Because the result of fighting that will get you this, okay? And in making social change, it's in many ways a science, just like mathematics, just like biology, okay, just like Sir Isaac Newton is considered the father of modern day physics, okay? A man named Ho Chi Minh is considered the father of the mechanics of social change, okay? And after him, there was Kwame Nkrumah, who you may have never heard of, or Frantz Fanon, okay? And then there was John Lewis, and then there was James Baldwin, ta-da, okay? These are all people who contribute to the science of making social change. There are a lot of other names too, okay? But like Abdul Nasser, which, what I'm saying, there's a science to it, and they fit into a structure. I get told often that when I talk about how Palestinian people in Gaza were literally slaughtered like animals, and I talk about the way they were treated for the last 70 years, being herded like cattle. Okay, I understand that because I lived it as a child. Okay, fascism, apartheid, segregation are all part of the same tree. Okay, today the best example of that has been how Palestinian people have been so dehumanized that we can just murder 100,000 of them and not bat an eye. Okay, and what we're paying attention to are the Epstein files. It's horrible. It's horrible and horrible. Now, it's horrible to traffic women. okay? You reading People magazine and about Jeffrey Epstein, okay? And day after day, people in the Sudan and in Gaza and in the West Bank are just being murdered and nobody gives a shit, okay? Once you know what you value, your ideology, in other words, then you know what you can care about. You decide what's important to you, okay? And that's your ideology. And then you decide what to act on. To me, it's injustice and dehumanizing people. I can't stand it because I lived it, okay? Two things. When I was 17 years old and 18 years old, Cornell University, Stanford University, Northwestern University, Yale, and Harvard came knocking on my parents' door. Because in those days, they would get 2 or 3 Puerto Rican students and maybe 2 or 3 black students, and that's all in those schools every year. And they would put them in their catalog so you could see them, and people would say they're not being racist. But they wouldn't let any more in, okay? And to be that student, you had to kind of be a super student, and they would compete for us, okay? There's a guy, well, my jacket's over there, there's a guy on there named Chris Robb who's running for Congress today. He was in the Yale University class of 1992, okay? And there were dozens and dozens of black and brown students that graduated from Yale University that year, okay? Instead of the 1 or 2 that they had when I was coming up, because they only had us, they could put us, what you call it, the nigger that sat by the door. They put you on the front cover of the magazine, and then they consider not racist. Now, it's pretty much, the black student has just as much of a chance as a white student to get in those elite universities and stuff. And that didn't exist in my time, okay? Once they let me in, or one other person, they weren't gonna let anybody else in. And that was one thing. The other thing is that, okay, your mother may not want you to hear this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. One of the most horrible things I ever saw in my life was when I was about 8 years old, and this one knocked on my great aunt's, my grandmother's sister's door. And she was bleeding all over the place. And she said, help me, help me. And what had happened was she had went to a woman in her church to help her end a pregnancy, because legally there was no place she could go to have that done, all right? And in her culture, having a baby out of wedlock would have kind of meant her life was over. Because in those days, you have a baby out of wedlock, they kind of hide you away, and sometimes you go live someplace else, or you live in a room by yourself, and you open the door and people pass you food, because that was a very shameful thing in those days. People didn't walk around saying, I'm a baby mama. They say that today, but back in those days, that was a horrible thing to do. So abortion was illegal. And so at the age of, I guess I might have been 6 or 7, I can't remember, but it was in the mid-1950s. This woman bled to death on my aunt's floor because she couldn't get an abortion. It was illegal. The one I got married to is a woman that fought for women's right to a legal abortion. And they had the Roe v. Wade. I don't know if you know what that means. Roe v. Wade now, okay, but it allowed women to have legal abortion anywhere in America, and at the same time, it allowed them to teach birth control. Because I personally believe that abortion should be legal, safe, and rare. You understand what I'm saying? Because women have rights to birth control and education about birth control, which will decrease the amount of unwanted pregnancies. But if they get there, it's nobody's business but theirs what happens to their body. And whether they have an abortion, it should be legal, and it should be readily available, and it should be safe, okay? Because that woman I saw that bled to death when I was a child, that used to happen every day somewhere in America, okay? Because they used to call them back alley abortions, okay? And they happen all of the time. That right that women have is being taken away, okay? And that's outrage. That pisses me off, okay? Because I know what a world without legal and safe abortion is like because I lived in it. There's a justification for everything you do. And you decide that justification yourself. When I was 18 years old, the most famous man in the world, okay, was a heavyweight champion of the world, and they took it away from him, okay, because he refused to go to Vietnam as a brown man to shoot little brown men who were trying to have their own freedom, okay? And all of a sudden, just like that, he was heavyweight champion of the world. Next day, he was not. A year later, after going, he won heavyweight champion in the world, but he was going all around the country doing good things for people in the community. And somebody asked him, why do you do this? And Muhammad Ali, that was the man's name, said that service to others is the price you pay for living on the planet. And that's what I've learned in the year since they took my title away. All right, that stayed with me. Okay, because when they came to get me to go shoot little brown men, and and they swear you into being in the Marine Corps, okay, and you say hold up your right hand and swear you oath to defend the Constitution, I stepped back because that's what Muhammad Ali did. Okay, don't be afraid to do what's right, because service to your community is the rent you pay for your time on earth. Muhammad Ali said that when I was your age, and it still serves me well. One of the things I learned in the Black Panther Party is there's theory and there's practice, okay? You read history, you read about those people that made change I was talking about before, Kwame Nkrumah, Frantz Fanon, John Lewis. All these people have extensive things for you to read and write. That's the theory of the science of making change, okay? But then there are people like Sosa Carmichael and Rap Brown and the guys in the Black Panther Party, okay? Those are people who put those things into practice. And once theory and practice come together, then you know what to do. Okay, theory is just stuff that's on paper. It's what somebody said, this might be the right thing to do. That might be the right thing to do. Okay, that's theory. Practice, it's going out there doing it. Okay, I had to find out when I was 15, for instance, that a guy named Sosa Carmichael, you know who that is, but you don't know who that is, okay? He was the scariest black man in America for about 2 years because he's the one raising his hand saying, Black Power. But who Sosa Carmichael really was, he was the president of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, okay? And they were out there knocking on doors in Mississippi, in rural Louisiana, okay, sneaking past the Klan, okay, and getting people to register to vote. They had read the theory and they were putting it into practice. You understand? And they found out what worked and what didn't work, what worked and what didn't work, okay? So today, there's nobody that can tell you what's the right path. You have to read and study. Okay, but you don't know that that's right until you put it into practice and see if it works for you. Theory and practice, okay? This didn't come from me. This came from a man named Frantz Fanon. Look him up. My son gave me what most people call a blog. It's a website. And he said, Dad, you talk about stuff all the time. You put stuff on social media. Consider this a blank sheet of paper and put your story there, okay? It's at timothyhayes.net, okay? So I don't put stuff in there as often as I should, but there are about 70 articles in there that the way my son has it fixed up is searchable by subject matter. And every time somebody says, write a book, Mr. Hayes, write a book, Mr. Hayes, I got to count the pages to see how much that is. But, you know, sometimes I say, well, if I croak tomorrow, my daughter will put that together and print it up. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to do some good while I'm still here.